Good morning or afternoon, depending on your time zone. I'm Jeannie Montblanc, and on behalf of the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange and our partners, I would like to welcome you to this webinar, Bringing It All Together, a panel discussion on fuel break perspectives. How do we move forward in an era of uncertainty? Presented by Jeremy Maestas with the NRCS, Justin Boeck, and Michele Crist with the BLM National Interagency Fire Center. This is the final webinar in our fuel break series. To view the past webinars in this series, you can visit our website at greatbasinfirescience.org or our YouTube channel at GB Fire Science. Before I introduce our presenters, I'll go over some webinar details. We're using Zoom webinar as our platform, and its only drawback is that attendees can't see other attendees. So if you would like, in your chat window, please change the to drop down to panelists and everyone, and enter your name and affiliation in the chat. We'll also be using the chat for questions, so please type in your questions at any time, and I'll field them to the speakers during the Q&A. Also, this webinar format will be a little different from the previous webinars since it's more of a discussion format. So each speaker will give opening remarks. We'll then respond to a few questions from me, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Now I'd like to welcome our presenters. Justin Boeck is a fire management specialist with the Bureau of Land Management National Interagency Fire Center. Michele Crist is a landscape ecologist, also with the Bureau of Land Management National Interagency Fire Center. And Jeremy Maestas is a wildlife biologist and national sagebrush ecosystem specialist with the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm going to stop sharing here and let Justin start with opening remarks.
All right, thank you, Jeannie, and thanks to the Great Basin Fire Science Exchange for hosting this webinar series. This is, I think, timely as we move into fire season in the West, and seeing a lot of drought conditions out there. Could be a fairly busy fire season this year for us. So anyway, and thanks also for inviting me to be part of this panel. As Jeannie said, I work at NIFC. I'm the BLM fire planning lead for the Bureau. In my past experience in fire suppression, I have about 20 years in fire suppression. I've worked for the Forest Service, National Park Service, and Big Bend National Park, and then finally in the BLM. And I've had experience on various hand crews and engines and in the fire suppression world. And the one thing that we always use really to put fires out is a fuel break, whether it's scratch and line or putting dozer line in or using water to eliminate the fuel source from a fire. That's what suppression is. And this series, I think, really sums up the proactive approach to what can we do in advance before the fires start, and where do we look for opportunities to put fuel breaks on the landscape to give the fire suppression community sort of a leg up. And when I say that, really what we're experiencing throughout the West is larger fires. They're increasing. We see a trend in large fires, in frequency of large fires. And one thing we do really well at is catching about 97% of our fires, but it's really the 3% that are growing and becoming an issue. And then that just perpetuates with the invasive grass cycle, and then increasing that footprint across the West, especially in the sage steppe ecosystems and low elevations. And so we have looked as a fire community, what can we do proactively? Is there something else we can do? And we go to the toolbox. Well, it's fuel breaks. That's what we use, on the fly to put fires out. So what can we do in the off season of fire season to put things in that give firefighters a leg up? And that's really what fuel breaks are. This whole discussion that we've had, great webinar series at this point, and I appreciate being on the panel to help answer questions. And I think some of the questions that folks have been considering and from a practitioner's viewpoint and lens is where do I put the fuel breaks? How do I prioritize where they go? And there's trade-offs with that. And a lot of fire managers, a lot of people are focused on, where is our population? Where's our wildland urban interface and our infrastructure that we need to protect? And that's typically the first place programs go, is around that human environment where human lives are at stake. And so what we've seen throughout the West is that's really where we prioritize fuel breaks. But now we're looking at vast areas of sage steppe habitat being burned. And with this invasive grass cycle, now we're going out to more remote areas to say, well, where are the areas we can put fuel breaks in to give firefighters a safe working environment to take on these large fires. And so that whole prioritization thing is I think, really one of those difficult things to wrap our heads around as resource managers. And the best solution to figure this out really is to collaborate with stakeholders and build that collaboration with the community that you're managing the resource around. And that, from what I've seen in my fire suppression history and my current job, that's really the most effective way to put in a strategic fuel break system, is to engage your stakeholders. And then when you actually go to implement the fuel breaks, where we see the most success is not just, it's not a one and done. You don't just go in and mow sagebrush or put in some sort of fuel break structure and then walk away. You have to maintain it, because if the firefighters can't use it, then it's all for nothing. And it can actually lead to more instances of failure than success. And we've seen that in our past. And I think fuel breaks also have been sort of promoted as a showstopper sort of event, where you put the fuel break in and fire comes and the fire stops. Well, that's not reality. We have to have firefighters in these fuel breaks, and we have to have firefighters that believe in these fuel breaks. And so they need to be maintained, and they also need to be maintained over a long period of time. So it's quite an investment, and it's one of those things that we want to phase in over time and take chunks, take small bites, I guess, at the big pie as we go through and develop these strategic systems. So those are just a few of the points, Janie, that I've picked up throughout the webinar series, and open to handle any questions as they come up. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Justin. Michele, you're up.
Okay, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen here. And go ahead and beginning. There we go. So thank you very much for having me. My name is Michele Crist. I'm a landscape ecologist with BLM Fire and Aviation at the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, Idaho. My background is landscape ecology, but underneath that umbrella, which is pretty broad in landscape ecology, I have a lot of expertise in fire ecology, forest ecology, sagebrush ecology, and also wildlife ecology too. And in my current position, basically I'm like a science advisor. I bring science in to BLM Fire and Aviation. I also conduct quite a bit of research and also do kind of landscape or spatial analyses that can really help inform wildland fire management decisions at a very broad scale. And so for my 5 minutes, really, I'm just going to talk about how potentially we can move forward in this era of uncertainty. And so over the past 2 decades, there has been this emerging frequent wildfire trend in sagebrush landscapes, especially in areas that historically burned very infrequently. And so this map here shows historic fire perimeters that have occurred across the Western US over the past 2 decades. And the different sagebrush communities are actually shown in green, and the dark red perimeters or polygons are fires that have burned in these sagebrush dominated landscapes. And the orange are fires that have burned in other vegetation types, primarily forested areas. And so just from 2000 to 2018, over 15 million acres of sagebrush have burned, primarily in the Great Basin, portions of Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. And we are seeing large fire sizes of 100,000 to over 400,000 acres that are becoming more common. We've also seen an increase in the rate of spread and extreme fire behavior. And these fires are largely the result of the invasion of non-native annual grasses that have increased our fire frequencies and the development of these grass fire cycles, which end up creating sort of this wide-scale landscape conversion to these invasive grasslands that frequently burn. And there's also been an increase in the risk to human life and property, loss of sagebrush obligates habitat, high fire management costs, and loss of cultural and economic resources. So this map here depicts altered fire regimes, and it was produced by calculating the ratio between our current large fire probability and the historic mean fire return interval for each vegetation type across the US. And so the results here just depict areas that are shown in yellow to red, where these areas are really experiencing too much fire. They have a surplus of fire compared to their historic fire cycles. Whereas the areas that are shown in green and then up to dark blue are really experiencing more of a deficit of fire, where they may have missed a fire cycle. And the smaller graph in the middle is just a map of the invasive annual grasses across the Great Basin. And so these graphics here just visually illustrate that the Great Basin is the largest area experiencing too much fire compared to historic trends. And that the surplus of fire that's shown in the yellow to the red in the Great Basin really correlates very well with these invasive annual grass presence. And traditionally, our wildland fire management has focused on the areas with a fire deficit and have really developed our fields management priorities based on this deficit and restoring historic conditions and fire regimes. However, now there's also a need to address areas that are experiencing too much fire, such as some of these areas in our sagebrush ecosystems. Where our traditional priorities for fields management will really not address the problem that we're having here. So to address these altered fire regimes on sagebrush lands, large-scale linear field break networks are being proposed as a potential solution. And there's 3 goals associated with field breaks. The first is to reduce the extent of uncharacteristic wildfire in the sagebrush biome and protected habitats, reduce our fire suppression costs, provide a safe and effective response to wildfire. There's also a lot of questions and uncertainty associated with field breaks. For instance, where should field break networks be placed? How many field breaks are needed out there? Are they effective at reducing wildfire extent overall for these sagebrush ecosystems? And can we ensure a commitment to funding long-term maintenance? In addition, there's some trade-offs to consider. We have limited research on field break impacts and overall operational effectiveness. They may contribute to further loss and fragmentation of greater sage-grouse and sagebrush obligates habitat, and they could be a potential vector for spread of planted non-natives and invasives. So to help address uncertainty and these questions and trade-offs associated with field breaks, wildfire risk assessments can be really useful in determining the best places for field breaks and also help prioritize just where field breaks should be implemented first. And so this fire risk assessment here on the right is from the science framework, And it combines three factors: the probability of wildfire, greater sage-grouse breeding habitats, and that habitat's resilience to fire and resistance to invasive grasses. So these final risk values that are shown in the larger map they're basically, the values are shown as a gradient, where the darker green areas represent habitats of high resilience and resistance to fire and invasives, but also have a low fire probability. While the dark red and more rust colors, orangey colors, represent habitats with a high fire probability, but a low resilience and resistance. And these are at a higher risk of being lost if they are to burn. And our 11,000 miles of planned fuel breaks is shown in dark blue, and they are overlaid on top of this fire risk assessment. And using this type of assessment at a very broad scale just can help to distinguish between habitats that are at risk to fire and their capacity to recover from fire and resist annual grass invasions. We can identify our vulnerable areas and then develop our management priorities for fuel break placement. So adaptive management and monitoring is also very helpful for addressing uncertainty. And there are many approaches for assessing condition and trend, treatment effectiveness, and also just using the adaptive management cycle. And these monitoring strategies can also be implemented at multiple scales, whether that's across the sagebrush biome, or also at regional management zones or district offices, and at local and site planning areas. In addition, scientific information can be derived from research on the many miles of existing field break networks that are already out there. And this can give us a better understanding of at least two primary function components of field breaks. That being, the first being the ecological effects, and also our operational effectiveness of field breaks. And then use this information collectively to help assist in our decision-making and inform field break construction and placement. And lastly, just investing in scientific research can really help address uncertainty and gain a better understanding of field breaks from an ecological and an operational perspective. And so BLM has invested pretty heavily in four main research areas. The first is in conducting retrospective ecological studies of existing field breaks, creating experimental designs and monitoring strategies for new field breaks, utilizing spatially explicit data and landscape models to help maximize field break effectiveness while minimizing potential negative impacts on ecosystems and wildlife. And finally, just developing better collaboration between scientists and land managers can really help us learn and adapt as we move forward. And so I'll just end it there and toss it to Jeremy. Thank you.
All right. Can someone confirm you can see my slides there?
Yep, looks great.
Perfect. Hey, everybody. Jeremy Maestas here with the NRCS. Thanks for joining. Hopefully you're able to participate throughout the month in the webinar series. It's pretty fantastic. Appreciate Janie's efforts, Corey's efforts to pull this all together. A little bit about me, wildlife biologist by training, but kind of call myself more of a rangeland ecologist these days. I kind of came to this issue as a biologist, working on the sage grouse issue, and just trying to find solutions. Most of us that live in the Great Basin, like I do here in Oregon, have seen way too many places that we care about converted to something else, at least for a long period of time, and at scales that are really scary. And so I think there's been this desire among the wildlife and fire community to come together around some solutions. And I think what we're doing is very healthy in this interdisciplinary fashion. You know, when I first started in these conversations, I distinctly remember certain biologists stand up and saying, well, we need more VLATs out there. And I'm like, what the hell's a VLAT? And so, you know, clearly we're not the ones who really understand the types of resources that are going to be needed to more effectively fight fire. But I'm pretty confident that working with our fuels and fire experts, we can come to a better solution here. But the first thing I want to start out with, I guess, as an ecologist, I feel the need to say that fire is not our enemy. It's a natural process in these systems. In fact, it's kind of a sign that our systems are still somewhat working, that we have that major driving force. But clearly the things we've been talking about over the last month and a half or so have been the sheer pace and scale of sagebrush loss is unsustainable for things that depend on those systems. The role of cheatgrass and other invasive grasses is also a major concern if these systems don't return back to those perennial dominated rangelands that sustain many of the values we care about out there. But fire continues to play an important role in our upper elevations in managing other threats like conifer expansion and infill. So we got to remember that as we carefully craft our strategic plans. And things have really improved over the last 10 years in terms of our understanding of the issues. We've always seen this and known this on the ground, but we now have spatial data to help us depict that resilience to fire varies across the landscape. And so Michele mentioned this quote R&R data, this abiotic soils information that we've used to kind of visually show where those more fragile warm and dry landscapes are, that if fire hits, we're more likely to see negative consequences. But for me, I just boil this all down to context. And if I could find a larger font, I probably would have put it on this slide to say context matters. And what I mean is that it's critically important to know where in the landscape we are when we start talking about planning lots of different actions, but fuel breaks in particular. And our NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife group put this little cartoon together just as a way to talk about context. And we think about it this way. Imagine there's parts of the landscape out there where things are pretty good, relatively low amounts of threats, whether that's cheatgrass or trees or other things. Those are places where preventative management actions could probably help keep that landscape in that state for quite a long time, and maybe more effectively than other parts of the landscape where really we're more into that emergency care situation where it's highly degraded. We have repeat fire. We know that we're going to be stuck doing things that we don't want to do there, mainly because it's a new reality. And in those cases, the actions we take may be much more aggressive. And so think about this as we're talking about fuel breaks. It's not just an yes/no question. It's also nuance, like, well, if we do them, what type of fuel break? You know, is it vegetated, bare ground? What native, non-native planting? You know, what is the size? What's the configuration? How much do we put out there? These are all things that have been discussed in previous webinars. With new remote sensing technology, we now have the ability to see the land like never before. This is an example out of Idaho, a new effort partnership launched last year called the Cheatgrass Challenge, where they're essentially taking new vegetation data, this one from the Rangeland Analysis Platform, depicting the relative amount of invasive annuals across the state of Idaho. And using this information, they could actually strategize a battle plan for defending those core areas that are still supporting relatively low amounts of annuals, in this case, less than 10% cover. But that just as importantly, they can also identify regions that are more dominated by the annuals where perhaps fuel breaks at a higher density, using things like forage kochia and all of that, are really more no regret strategies, because you've already transitioned on a very large scale to novel ecosystem. Whereas in those green places, something like the bottom right photo here, maybe it's more like proceed with caution. We know that's fairly intact and we don't want to make it worse. We don't want to accelerate the invasion of annuals. Perhaps we can tweak the types of management actions we're doing and make sure that they serve both fuels management perspective and preservation of that kind of functioning ecosystem. And we've got that data available pretty broadly now. This is an effort, Western Governors Association toolkit for invasive annual grass management, put together a spatial data set like the one that Idaho used, that others around the West can use to inform planning efforts, at least from a cheatgrass standpoint. We're also getting better and better data on fuels, that herbaceous fuel load that is driving, is in a big part a driver of those wildfires in our rangelands. And so folks have talked about the fire triangle here, right? And the one thing that we can manipulate is the fuels. Well, we're now able to get biomass data in terms of pounds per acre of perennial plants and annual plants through time. And we can get that not only on an annual basis, but every 16 days because of the linkage with Landsat. And so this is the type of information that's improving our ability to strategically target our work every day. And one example of that is, this is some exciting preliminary work, Joe Smith, sponsored by the USDA ARS out of Burns, University of Montana, NRCS Work and Lands for Wildlife. They're taking that biomass data and coupling it up with the climate information we have to develop better fire probability maps that allow us to see where the likelihood of those large fires is if we get an ignition. And this is yet to come, still being worked on, but just know that every day that technology gets better. And imagine what we could do with these types of maps, one being kind of the average fire probability over the last decade. And then importantly, the trend, where's it getting worse? Those red places are going to be places where a very integrated landscape fuels treatment a strategy will be needed. Otherwise, business as usual will get you results as usual in those places. And then finally, we got to bring in those resource and values layers, right? Whether it's human or in our case, wildlife and sagebrush ecosystems, a big deal. 10 years ago, you could be forgiven for not knowing where sage-grouse leks and priority areas were. That's not the case today. We now have so much data that can help us understand, whether the placement of our actions is going to be in a hotspot for these critters, or maybe it's on the fringe, and you can really weigh those risks much better. And the last thing I just want to close with, many have mentioned this, this is a human problem, a social problem. We don't have clear answers on this. Fuel breaks are just one piece of an overall fire management strategy. We've heard that from Lance Okeson and others. This is planning that's part of multiple scales: West-wide, nationwide fire resource planning, statewide, district level, and then local backyard stuff. We've even had folks will acknowledge that this is something that we're reluctantly using. We don't want to have to do this, but our fire regimes are out of whack, and we don't have a lot of options to really get at that 3% of fires that are getting away from us. And so this is one of those things we're doing reluctantly and trying to minimize the damage to other values as we go. And the best way to move forward, in my opinion, just in this era of uncertainty, is with those community-based partners, giving them the best information and technology we have at our fingertips, while coupling that with the co-produced science that we need to monitor the outcomes and the efficacy and adapt as we go. And so with that, Janie, I think we'll come back on and go to some panel questions.
Great, thank you so much, Justin, Michelle, and Jeremy for summarizing this series and then those opening remarks on the issues we're facing. So the first question, and just to reorient the audience, I have 3 questions for the panelists, and then after that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So type your questions in if you have them. The first question, given the uncertainty about fuel break efficacy, what does fuel break success look like to you? Who wants to jump in and start?
I can start off, Ginny. So the uncertainty aspect is I guess from a fire suppression standpoint, are we providing a fuel break that is sufficient to put firefighters in to take on large landscape scale fires with extreme fire behavior? And so to me, that's where really the efficacy comes in, is are we providing that safe environment for firefighters to engage large fires? There's probably a mixed bag of thought on the efficacy of, are they stopping the fires? Well, that's really where the debate comes in. And I think it's because fuel breaks have been oversold really in the past, that they are a showstopper, and they aren't. They're designed for the fire community. So that's kind of where I go with that question.
Thanks, Justin.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Okay. For me, I had a number of ideas of what success might look like, just from my perspective. I mean, first for me is, when we can sort of design fuel break networks that are really optimized to meet our wildland fire objectives, while at the same time minimizing their potential negative impacts to ecosystems and wildlife out there, so that, we're meeting all of our objectives out there, essentially. Success to me also includes, it's beyond fuel breaks as well. It's also including invasive species management, because I think without invasive species management, our fire situation really is just going to get worse and worse and worse. And so just thinking about fuel break strategies alone, to me, isn't really going to address the root of the cause here of what's going on in these ecosystems. And second success to me would be, or third, I guess, would be just in being able to measure, are we really seeing a reduction in this uncharacteristic fire regime across this biome? To me, that would be a measure, I hope, of success. And that fuel breaks are really just put in the right places where we can really make a difference in fire suppression efforts. So I think we really need to think about strategizing where the fuel breaks go in these areas that are burning. They have a higher probability of burning. They have a higher ignition rate, whether that be from humans or sometimes lightning. And also if they could be in close proximity to where our fire resources are stored, our bases, so that our people can get out there and suppress these fires. Because if they're too far away, and if it takes 3 hours to get out there, the fire is just going to burn right through under these extreme conditions. So really thinking about it from those type of operational perspectives from a landscape scale. That was a lot, sorry.
No,
I'll keep mine brief, since Michelle and I think a lot alike as ecologists, I suppose. Here's what I think. Short-term fuel breaks, smaller fires. If we start seeing fires that are in the tens of thousands of acres instead of hundreds of thousands, let's reduce an order of magnitude on our fires, that's success in the short term for me. Long term, it is about cheatgrass. Why should we have to worry about a natural process working in our systems? Why? it's because it's not coming back the way we want it to. So I think working towards addressing that in strategic places is ultimately where we need to head.
Great, thank you. Next question. For folks considering the use of fuel breaks, what advice would you have for them based on what we know at this time?
Jeremy, go ahead. I'll follow up.
Use it surgically. And like I was trying to articulate earlier, in places that it's already cheatgrass dominated, we've lost, and it's really mitigating the worst of that cheatgrass fire cycle, we should be all hands on deck in helping the BLM in particular get this going, because that's taking a lot of resources away from defending places we really care about. I mean, from an ecological standpoint. So it's a nuanced approach. It's let's get behind them and really get those projects in place so that we can free up resources to go talk about the surgical application of fuel breaks as part of a holistic fuels and fire management strategy in those large core areas that we want for our kids and our grandkids to not be, to not look like the Snake River Plain in 30 years.
Thanks. Justin, did you want to follow up?
It's hard to add to that. From what we know at this point in time, with fuel break strategies, as we get them implemented on the landscape at the appropriate, with the appropriate dimensions that firefighters need to safely engage, we can take on large landscape scale fires. We've seen that. We have reports of success with fuel breaks. Now, what we don't know is the extent, the amount of fuel breaks we need to really address the large landscape scale fires that we're seeing. But we do know they work. We do know they can be effective, but they take a lot of time. They take commitment. It takes a lot of money and maintenance to ensure that they're in place and they're there when the firefighters need them. The other thing that we do know is that they need to be located along roadways, and that's critical. A lot of models and risk assessments I've seen will say, well, we need fuel breaks in this area. Well, there's not a road system potentially, and we need a good road system. And like Michele was saying, we have to have good access into these, and so that requires a road. And a lot of times what we've seen is with that road system, you also see invasives along the roadbed, or along those road systems. And so when we put in the fuel breaks there, if it's in a degraded area, it's going to take multiple entries with either herbicide or seedings to combat that invasive grass or noxious weeds that we're seeing. And so it's a big time commitment, and it needs a lot of thought before we put anything on that landscape.
I would just second that real quick before Michele goes. I thank you for mentioning that. There's never been a fuel break that hasn't had weeds. Why don't we just plan to do weed control on every one of them on a regular basis? And we're getting better and better tools, and as far as herbicides, to manage annuals in particular multiple years in a row. So I think this is a big need that could potentially take the temperature down on a lot of people's concerns about these.
So, I would agree with everything that has definitely been said so far. And maybe just add that, so if the question is based on what we know now, we do have a lot of information right now that can help us prioritize in terms of where we can put in these fuel breaks, but also test these fuel breaks, learn from these fuel breaks. we have some existing field breaks out there that we can already learn from. What's working, what didn't work, were they put in areas where they're just constantly fires are burning through them, or, compared to other areas where we could get our people there and in time to suppress the fire. I think there's an opportunity for us to learn a whole lot about field breaks and where they are effective, and potentially what we might need to modify to make them even more effective. At the same time, it's always, proceed with caution. And I think in Jeremy's presentation, he had that one slide that showed, in those degraded areas, that's where we're seeing the most fire. And those are great places to put field breaks because that system is degraded right there. And that helps just keep areas that are still relatively intact, even in those low resilience and resistance areas that are high quality habitat. Just putting field breaks in the degraded areas could also help protect those adjacent areas of intact habitat. So thinking about more strategies like that. And oh gosh, what else? And just really, I think working with fire management officers on the ground. I mean, I've seen some of these proposals for field breaks, and they would look at it and say, that's not where I would put a field break. I'd put it on this particular highway where we're getting a lot of these fire ignitions, and then I can stop the fire before it does go over the hill into that sagebrush habitat that we want to protect. So I think it's a mix of, sort of these landscape analyses, but also bringing in that information from the ground, where our fire management people really know that fires are starting and where it's a big issue, and considering winds, the direction of winds and the direction that fires typically burn, can all play a part in terms of finding the most effective areas for field breaks.
Great, thank you all. My final question, trade-offs have been a theme repeated throughout this webinar series. What are some ways land managers can assess trade-offs when evaluating risks versus potential benefits of field breaks? Anyone?
Yeah, I guess I'll keep it simple. I did talk about a lot of the spatial data sets, but it's also a local conversation about values. Imagine standing on a hilltop in that landscape and asking yourself, are we okay with sagebrush being lost from this ridgeline to that ridgeline in potentially a day, a week? That's what's happening. And so we really need to answer that question. And that may not have, I hate to say it, a lot of data behind it. You may have to just go, well, no, I'm not. And or if I am, where do we stop this? Where could we stop this in this landscape to have cells or chunks that are, like I said, 100,000 acre chunk that if that got burned in one day, we'd all go, yep, we agreed to that as part of just this negotiation about fragmentation versus fuel breaks versus, all the different options we have. And so it is 100 shades of gray when it comes to fuel break management. I mean, but we do have some information. We are not totally helpless in evaluating those risks.
Thank you.
And, I'll chime in as well. Yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of evaluating trade-offs, these types of risk assessments that bring in our values can be really instrumental in thinking about that just from a landscape scale perspective, from a fragmentation perspective, looking at habitat patch sizes. All of that type of information is really helpful in thinking through some of the trade-offs of putting in these field breaks. Adaptive management and monitoring, to me, is really helps with, trying to deal with trade-offs. What are our monitoring strategies telling us? What are our monitoring results? Being able to use that information and then just modify where needed. As well as, to me, in trade-offs, I think a lot of times, you know, field breaks are looked at more as like a black and white issue, where, and I think Justin sort of alluded to this, you know, it's, okay, you know, there's the people that want the field breaks and the people that are worried about the ecological effects of field breaks. And really, you know, as Jeremy said, there are many different shades of gray. And, you know, it's really bringing all that information together and being open and really working through and tackling these different issues and thinking about it from an integrated perspective in terms of where we put these field breaks and where they can be the most effective. So I guess I would offer that, that it's really coming together and thinking outside the box.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think we all agree that large landscape scale fires are a concern and we need to address them. And really the tools that we have in the toolbox are fire suppression communities and then proactive fuels management. And anything that we can do to give the suppression community a leg up to catch these large landscape scale fires, that's what we're looking into. Those trade-offs, when you actually go to locate a field break network, it has to be strategic and it has to include the suppression community, as well as all the stakeholders. And then identifying, like Michele said, risk assessments are good. It's a great starting point, really, to pinpoint on a map where you think your priority areas are. And that's really the first step, is prioritize where you want to put these networks in. But you have to have that fire suppression group engaged, because they're the ones that suppression community is ultimately the group that's going to be using those field breaks.
Great, thank you so much. And just really quickly, Michele, since it's come up a couple times, the monitoring and adaptive management, does BLM have funding for that? Or is that what the USGS is doing with their study that's taking?
Well, yes and yes. I would say at different scales. BLM has their AIM monitoring strategy that we do implement, you know, looking at landscape level, being able to measure, you know, basically collect information about our vegetation conditions, but also be looking at how our objectives in our projects are being met. I think what we, BLM, can do even a better job at is being able to quantify that information together to really answer some of these bigger questions of what is the difference we're making across a very broad landscape. And I think that information is available. We just, you know, really need to prioritize on how to quantify that information and then use it back in, you know, put it back into our management decisions. So there's that part. We do have that. The second part is, yeah, we do have some research that we are doing with USGS that is looking at developing some experimental designs, and as well as developing some performance metrics and different monitoring strategies specifically for field breaks. And we do have some sampling protocols where USGS is right now going out and collecting some information within field breaks, looking at the effectiveness, the operational effectiveness of them, looking at them from the potential of, you know, this invasive spread. So we have all these different questions that we are trying to address. And so we have a multitude of different projects going on right now.
Great, thanks so much for that clarification. All right, so now we'll take questions from the audience. The first one, in your experiences, this is for everyone, in your experiences, how well does crested wheatgrass do as a planted species in green strips? Are there any native species that are useful in green strips?
Well, I'll throw out my opinion, being the guy who doesn't actually do these on the ground, but I talk about them a lot. And I did write a technical note with a few BLMers who've done a lot of these over the years, like Mike Pellant. And what I learned through that effort is, yeah, there's a lot of different plant materials. It does depend on the the climate and the site that you're on and the soils. If you're on those less than 8-inch soils, 8 inches of precip, it's going to be very hard to get a lot of our plant materials established and for them to actually persist. We've been studying these. We've got garden trials out on the Snake River Plains. You can go see plantings that were done 15, 20 years ago and see how many of those plants have persisted. That's a key question in an era of climate change. But as Lance, I think, was articulating in his webinar, everybody is thinking along the lines of, as you get higher elevation, you've got more options, and natives definitely become the preferred alternative there. So it's really about where you are and the options you have in the toolbox. But the key question with the material is, can you break up the fuel continuity? In other words, do you have gaps between the plants? If it's a very productive species, it may not function very well as a fuel break or as a green strip planting within a fuel break.
Yeah, and just to add to that, maybe I've kind of glossed over this, but the whole point of a fuel break is to lower the fire behavior and lower those flame lengths and that fire intensity so that we can engage along that roadway and have success. And that can be done with native species. And like Jeremy's saying, we have more options as we go higher in elevation. As far as crested goes, I've seen a lot of crested seedings. If they're maintained, actually sometimes through grazing practices, they can be very effective. But I've also seen seedings where they've been very high stature and produce real intense fires. So it's sort of, one of those things. If you put them in, it'd be good to maintain them. And you can also maintain some of these areas with prescribed fire. It's just that we're a little limited on the prescribed fire side of things in our sage steppe communities at this juncture. So.
Great, thank you.
And, I would just add to that a lot of our information on the different plant species that we have been putting in field breaks is really coming from an agricultural perspective. And I think there is an opportunity here to do some research in looking at the different plant species, whether they be native or non-native, and identifying the best places to put those in. But I've heard that before from others of people bring that up quite a bit. Why aren't we using native species? And there may be some native species out there that we just haven't considered yet that could function very well in field breaks. And there's an opportunity to look at that and test it.
Great, thank you. Next question, what is the current status of the body of fuels treatment effectiveness monitoring for fuel breaks? Do we have more data on effectiveness than we did a few years ago? I've heard anecdotally that there can be more of a mosaic island burn patterns in areas with fuel break networks.
Is it possible to see that question? It's a long question.
So it's the question about fuel break treatment effectiveness, right? And we have that fuel treatment effectiveness monitoring out there nationally, and we're trying to gather more and more information on that, so we can tell that story and how it's working and share those stories of effectiveness and success stories. And that's something that we work on at the national level to communicate that message out to the suppression community, what's working, what's not working. And that database is growing substantially. But it can only grow if we have the treatments on the landscape. So it's sort of a chicken or egg thing. But I mean, we can do research on field breaks, but we have to have field breaks in place to do the research. So they have to grow together, obviously, and in a measured way. But the second part of that question, Jenny, was what? Sorry, can you repeat?
I've heard anecdotally that there can be more of a mosaic island burn pattern in areas with fuel break networks.
Right, and I saw a satellite imagery photo post Martin fire, I think the largest fire in Nevada's history, and it was 400,000+ acres in a couple days, and they did have a fuel break network out there. It was very minimal. It wasn't maintained very well, But there was one area where there was no suppression resources on this fuel break, but as the fire hit the fuel break, it checked up in many areas and then spotted over, and it left islands behind where it did spot over. And it was very evident in some of the satellite imagery we saw post-fire. So when you don't have fire suppression engaged in some of these fuel breaks, we are seeing some islands developed.
You know, I'm going to add to that. I was on a large fire assessment for that Martin fire. And that fire was an unusual event where we had really high winds and it was traveling fast, and the spotting plane couldn't even keep up with the head of the fire. And under those conditions, you know, that area, there was a lot of topography. And that topography interacted with the wind and also created these unburned patches across the entire burned area. And I was really interested in that from an ecological perspective, because typically what we do see are where fires have just burned through and basically burned just a majority of everything in its path. But this one, the winds were so high, it was causing the fire to jump over sagebrush areas. And I know some people have definitely correlated that with the fuel breaks. But from what I saw when I was out there, and when you really look at the landscape imagery and the topography, it was the winds, and there were a bunch of different things that were happening out there to create those unburned sagebrush patches in that very mosaic wildfire or burned area.
Great, thank you. Jeremy, if you don't have anything to add to that, I will move on to the next question. If improving access for firefighters is the key issue, why not focus on improving roads surfaces, or maybe doing fuel breaks on, you know, around roads, and without creating the fuel breaks in intact sagebrush communities? Wouldn't this reduce the risk of uncertainty, a fuel break impacts, limit maintenance cost, and provide a measure of success? So I guess the short question, why fuel breaks in intact sagebrush communities?
That's a great question. From a suppression standpoint, if we could just get maintained routes, that's a great measure of success for our suppression group. A lot of times access is the key issue. But when we do get the access, we also want to be able to operate along those road surfaces. And if we have roads that are maintained well, we can get the access. But when we get in there, if we have fire behavior that's not sustainable, like we can't engage, we can't put people in there. And so we need that buffer along that road system to lower that fire behavior so that firefighters can engage in fire suppression efforts. So
it's kind of really about that flame length, right, Justin? How high those flames are getting up and your ability to safely actually put people in there.
Exactly. Yep. And another thing too is these fuel breaks in extreme conditions, and like Michelle was saying, with winds, they're going to spot over the fuel breaks. We know that. We've experienced that. That's a given. Everyone experiences that when they fight fire, is spotting. But when you're there, it's a lot easier if you have a fuel break to pick up spots. When they spot into, you know, adjacent across the road into a mode fuel system, it's usually a flashier fuel, but you can get on it, you can see it, and you can move up and down that road system to catch your spots because your fire behavior is lower. And so that's really, you know, we know we're going to get spots, and we're going to have to deal with those along these fuel breaks. But without that modification of fire behavior, it's really difficult to send people down those road systems from a manager standpoint. So.
Yeah, and I would just add to that you know, especially on those highways where you are getting a lot of those starts, having that buffer also buys some time for resources to be able to get there, because maybe that fire has started, but it's creeping through, and that fuel break, that buffer, is actually keeping the flame lengths down, and the fire may not be traveling quite as fast as it would under conditions where, there's the conditions for higher flame lengths. So it does also bide a little bit of time for our resources to get out there to be able to suppress that fire.
Did you want to add to that, Jeremy?
Nope. I want to answer this last question.
The green strips along roadways?
Yeah, the road departments.
Okay, yes. Should road departments consider creating green strips along roadways where fire starts are common?
I know we don't have much time, so I just want to say, yeah, I mean, we see that already happening on our major highway systems. You can drive 95 through the Great Basin and see it in the Winnemucca district. Lots of successes there. The one caution I would have, and a pet peeve of mine, is driving out of Bend where I live and driving east and watching road maintenance people try to do a fuel break with no ecology. And we have to talk about invasive species, and we need to work together with our road departments, because a lot of these do take from a shrub to a grass, but they may not know that grass is cheatgrass. And so those are places where I see more cheatgrass along that than anywhere else in the landscape. And we don't have to live with that. We have tools we can use to make that better and really solve that problem. So that's my shameless plug for working together with your road departments.
Great. Did anyone want to add to that?
I agree.
Well, I would add to that and say maybe leave the fuel break portion and the vegetation to the federal agencies that have the ecologists that can help with that, and leave that shoulder and the borrow pit and that gravel apron really is a key that we've seen on these major roadways. Because if you have a high traffic area and people pull off and there's cheatgrass right on the shoulder, it's starting fires. So if we can get and work with the highway departments, and we have been in BLM, we have agreements in some areas to just maintain sort of that right of way piece in that borrow ditch, that's a key. That has shut down a lot of fires on the I-84 corridor between Boise and Mountain Home. So we've seen it in action, and it's been a really big success working with our highway departments on that right away piece.
Great, thanks. Did you want to add, Michelle, or are you good?
I agree with both. Whatever Jeremy and what Justin said.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, I know Jeremy has to go and we're a little past the hour, so great discussion. Thank you so much, all of you, and the audience, for your participation and questions. We would greatly appreciate it if you would take our 3-question survey that will appear after I close the webinar. The recording of this webinar will be posted on our GB Fire Science YouTube channel and also on our website by tomorrow, and the link will automatically be sent to you through a Zoom webinar follow-up email. If you have further questions regarding this or other webinars, please call or email me anytime. Again, thank you all for attending this webinar, and thank you so much, Justin, Michelle, and Jeremy, for your discussion, your insights, and expertise today. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
All right,
Yeah.
have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.